Yeah, yeah, we'll do now.
Excellent. Thank you. So, just some background. This decolonizing development study group was created a year ago when I joined the DSA development study group. The DSA is a Development Studies Association, which is a UK-based membership organization for all those studying and researching or interested actually in development, working in development as development practitioners. We set up this study group in order to reflect on four main themes. The first one was how do we problematize and rethink the continuities and divergences of the colonial genealogy of development studies. The second question we were interested in is how do we conceptualize alternative approaches in development or just simply other alternatives to development? The third question we were interested in is how do we make sense of the current uprisings of the global south taking place in the global south? How do we theorize from the margin? Because as development thinkers, lecturers, academics, or even scholars, we are really very much in the doing of development. And I think the interest here is to see what is happening in other cultural contexts, social cultural contexts, and also try to make sense of it. And finally, the fourth strand of this decolonizing study group is interested in anti-racism, anti-sexism, and equitable partnerships in development. So we have all seen the current debates around Me Too, and in the development world, this has been echoed by Aid Too. So a lot of contestation of the white gaze in development. And this is a combination, it is a combination of all this that led us to decide to create this decolonizing development study group. So we are really excited to launch this study group today with a few partners. As you know, this is also the first of the CAS, Center of African Studies seminars for this year. The seminars are convened by Professor Paul Nugent, and this is really a leading platform to rethink African studies, to rethink development as academics, but also as practitioners. So the Center of African Studies is one of Europe's leading center researching African studies, but we are also, we would like to think that we are also one of the largest and most vibrant centers researching and delivering a range of courses in international development, in African studies, but also global development challenges, etc. And in this Center of African Studies, we have a working group, a decolonizing working group, which was initially set up by Dr. Puja Jain and Dr. Hazel Gray, who is today part of the speaking panel. So this CAS Decolonizing Working Group is interested in engaging with staff and students alike in exploring, understanding, and pursuing decolonization in their teaching, research, and in their everyday life. So that's what we do. We are teaching development, we are researching African studies, we are also interested in having this self-reflexive account of our practice, and that's why we have this decolonizing study group. And the third partner in this event is RaceEd, which is a newly set up network across the University of Edinburgh, which is concerned with race, racialization, decolonial studies from a multi-disciplinary perspective. And the convener of this network is Professor Nassar Mir, and he's unfortunately preparing for his own presentation, but hopefully we'll have access to the recording. So the focus of the event today is pretty much reflection, but a collective reflection about the retrospect and the prospects of decolonizing development studies. How can we make sense of all the efforts that had been made in this sense? Is it enough? But first of all, what is decolonization? When we talk about decolonization, I think there are as many definitions or conceptualizations as there are of scholars or academics. So today we have invited a very diverse range of academics and scholars thinking and researching this topic. And they will be able to share with us what decolonizing development means from their specific disciplinary perspective. But we also have in common the fact that we are all researching Africa. So we will discuss this topic, decolonizing development, with an African perspective today. And this doesn't mean that the decolonizing development, the DSA decolonizing development is only interested in that. No, this is the first event of a series, and we hope to be able to move our gaze and to move our focus from Africa to Asia, to Southeast Asia, to South America, and other parts of the world. So first of all, this event is, we will first have the speaker's presentation, and after that, we will have the Q&A, which will be moderated by Sarah Jane Kopenok. So if you have any question in the meantime, do not hesitate to share it with SJ. So now I will stop sharing my screen in order to share the bios of our guest speakers. The first speaker today is Dr. Marion Uma, who is, I will copy and paste in the chat box so that you can have access to it at the same time. Okay. I cannot see the chat box. Anyway, I will go ahead and we'll share it later. Dr. Marion Uma completed her doctoral studies in sociology under the South Africa Chair of Social Policy Initiative. And she completed her PhD then in 2009. Marion is a past recipient of the Social Science Research Council Next Generation of Africa Social Science Research Fellowship. She has previously worked at various national, international, non-governmental organizations and the United Nations as a social protection specialist. Her research interests include sociology, social policy, social protection, policymaking, and political economy of Africa's development. She has published in critical social policy and has a book chapter in the African political economy. Then we will have Dr. Puja Jain, who is a postdoctoral researcher on India and South Asia at EHESS, l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales en France. She is working on a 3-year research project on the new actors, dynamics, and territorialities of development. She did her PhD at Sciences Po, Paris, where she studied partnerships for development through a case study on India and Senegal. So you know now where we met. And her research interests include development practice and policy, public-private partnerships in development, international relations, and South-South cooperation. She has written and published articles for the French Agency of Development, Agence Française de Développement, Afrique Contemporaine, and Le Soleil, which is a Senegalese daily. Our third speaker is Dr. Rotel Nijay Pele, who is an assistant professor in international social policy and public policy at the LSE. So social policy is well represented today with Marion and Rotel. Rotel is a previous Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the Oxford Department of International Development. She is a Liberian academic, activist, and author of the forthcoming monograph, Dual Citizenship and Its Discontents in Africa, the Political Economy of Belonging to Liberia. We are so looking forward to it. And she is also the author of an anti-corruption children books, Bagba and Jade. At Oxford, she previously served as a senior researcher on the project Migrants in Countries in Crisis, which examined the migration implications of crisis in 6 countries, Central Africa, Ivory Coast, Lebanon, Libya, South Africa, and Thailand. Welcome, Rotel. Then we have Dr. Hazel Gray, a colleague who is a senior lecturer in African Studies and International Development at the Center of African Studies, Edinburgh. Her research interests cover the political economy of industrial change in Africa, political economy of institutions, and heterodox economics. Her recent book, Turbulence, okay, let me use my English accent, Turbulence and Order in Economic Development, was published by Oxford University Press in 2008. She is co-chair of the Journal of Critical African Studies. She completed her PhD at SOAS in the Department of Economics and worked at the Department of International Development at LSE before joining the Center of African Studies, Edinburgh. Hazel previously worked at the Ministry of Finance in Tanzania from 2000 to 2004, and she was the lead author of the UNDP Human Development Report for Tanzania in 2014 and in 2017. And last but not least, we have Professor Sabelo Gacheny, who is a professor and chair of epistemologies of the Global South, with emphasis on Africa in the University of Bayreuth in Germany. He previously worked as a research professor and director of scholarship at the Department of Leadership and Transformation, and used to be the principal and vice chancellors at the vice chancellor's office at UNISA, the University of South Africa. He was also the 2019 visiting professor at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Studies, JIAS, at the University of Johannesburg. He is a leading decolonial theorist with 100 publications in the field of let me repeat, 100 publications in the field of African studies, politics, African development, and decolonial theories. His latest major publications are Epistemic Freedom in Africa, Deprovincialization and Decolonization, Rethinking and Unthinking Development, Perspective on Inequality and Poverty in South Africa and Zimbabwe, that he co-edited with Busani Mpofu. And he also wrote Decolonization, Development and Knowledge in Africa, Turning Over a New Leaf with Routledge in May 2020. And I'm very pleased to be doing a review of that latest book. So thank you so much to all for agreeing to join us today. We are extremely pleased to have you and to have this conversation with you. First of all, just to ask everyone, to remind everyone that we have disabled the chat function. So if you have any question, do direct it to Sarah Jane Kupanok, who is the co-chair, or to myself. And I will just remind our speakers that they have 10 minutes each to share their views, their experience on decolonization. So I would like to welcome Marion Uma. Marion, you have 10 minutes.
Marion, I think you're still on mute.
Okay. Thank you, Rama, and everybody who's participating in this seminar. And I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I wouldn't know how to make it on Zoom. But then I think, I mean, looking at the questions that we have and looking back and my evaluation on the colonial project in development studies, I think on one hand, there is progress, and progress has been made in decolonizing development and development studies. I think one example is just this forum that we have, you know, and the working group on decolonizing development studies, and forums that have been put up for discussions through conferences, and which have provided opportunity for discussion on decolonizing development studies. But also we see there's a greater demand by students, and I think this is a resurgence from even you know, the times of Ngugi wa Thiong'o at University of Nairobi, who was a catalyst in abolishing the English department, calling for the abolition of the English department at the University of Nairobi. And now we are seeing a resurgence and a greater demand by students, but also faculty in terms of changes in syllabus and changes of curriculum for development studies. And also, I think our progress would be that there's now a growing body of intellectuals, people who are writing, people who are researching on decoloniality of development and development studies. And people are challenging the norms of development studies. And so in that case, we can say that we have seen there has been a progress. But then on the other hand, I think I get a bit pessimistic. And like Cheru, I feel that the present and the future is a bit problematic, As of now, we can say that there is no clear sense of an Africa telos in terms of development. And this is making it almost by default that it's Western generated theories of development that then get foisted in Africa. And but then on the other hand, just the term itself, just thinking about the terms itself that has persisted development, and there's still the perpetuation and the persistence of the colonial legacy and racism within development as a term and even as a word. And development has been seen as an intervention, and there you have the developer and the person being developed, and that has continued and persists until now, despite all these years, And the idea of development and developing, and Africa, for example, and is still seen as not complete, Just the word developing then denotes a connotation of incompleteness, and which is really flawed, because you can't say we are incomplete, And so there's also, we have to think about also the production of knowledge and the labor of intellectual knowledge, which has persisted to favor the West. And most of the time, indigenous scholarship and knowledge on welfare and well-being that comes from the African continent is ignored. It's not fully acknowledged, and most of the time there's even erasure of it. But the centering of Western knowledge has continued. And so on that note, then you can almost say that this pessimism about the whole decoloniality project in development studies. But I think some of the strategic priorities for a decolonial agenda in development studies, looking at my own work, which is in social policy, social protection and policy making. And now I'm starting to gain quite some interest into the randomized control testings as a new area of development that is coming up, or I don't know that it's new or not. But I think first, I think the priorities, first of all, is I think those of us who are critical of development as it is now, we need to continue to challenge and question in our teaching and in our writing and research, and ask to what extent development agendas and even the studies, like for example, even the whole idea of cash transfers, the whole idea of RCTs, how have this continued to perpetuate the intellectual domination of Western scholarship, And to what extent, have they taken up space of the development of our own knowledge, indigenous knowledge and theoretical perspectives for solutions to Africa? Mm-hmm. The second priority, I think, would be, because I don't think there can be a decoloniality, we can't talk about decoloniality without talking about alternatives. We need to provide alternatives and a reimagination and a theorizing from our own context, yeah? We have to provide alternatives to what is sold to us as development or development studies, as Africa. For example, the idea of cash transfers, and now we see that cash transfers is seen as the new frontier, or the new frontier in development, and everybody's saying, oh no, just give them cash, the whole idea of just giving cash. Mm-hmm. But this is not enough in providing and even improving the welfare and the well-being of humans. Mm-hmm. And here I'm using welfare and the well-being of humans very, very deliberately from development, because most of the time development has been seen as just poverty reduction, Mm-hmm. But it has to be, people have to be at the center of it, and therefore it has to be about human welfare and well-being. And we provide an alternative. For example, in my work on cash transfers and social policy, we provide an alternative in the form of transformative social policy, which an area that has been researched on and has has been promoted by such scholars as Mkandawire, as Jimmy Adeshina. And so we have to find alternatives to what we are being sold as development on the continent and look at them and provide alternatives to that. And I think maybe a third priority, which may seem radical, is I think we need to abandon the whole development agenda, you know, and abandon all these grand ideologies and fixed developmental schemas and models that we hear about. You know, for example, the SDGs. You know, I'm just thinking about the SDGs. When you think about the SDGs, it's a project. It's a move about homogenizing and making universal, you know, development by organizations like the UN and the World Bank. Yeah, mm-hmm. But we know that development is not universal. It has the plural model. But then Africa finds itself in a place where it is boxed into the whole run now towards cash transfers and looking at RCTs and randomized control testing as a means to make development priorities and policy dimensions. But this grand ideologies often fail because, first of all, they do not take into cognizance the context of each of our countries, for example. And second, they're also very divorced from history and the historicization of the continent, and even of each country on the continent. But then we find ourselves boxed into these grand ideologies and schemes that then just take away focus from what needs to be helpful and needs to be needful to the continent. And I think thinking about how do I decolonize? How do I decolonize development studies through my own teaching and research? I think the first question I ask myself is, in whose work am I engaged with? You know, those are questions I ask myself even as I do my research. Am I actively seeking to draw from theories that are emerging from the continent, from thinking that's emerging from the continent? Whose work am I citing, for example? Yeah, does it reflect the wide knowledge the wide knowledge that we have on the continent? You know, looking at platforms like Codercia, yeah, which over the years, a lot of years have gathered a lot of information and a lot of writings, a lot of research by prominent African scholars and all. And am I drawing from that repository? Am I looking through that? And I think second, also just thinking to myself, to what extent am I making my research accessible to those, especially on the continent, who may not have access? You know, there are some universities, I mean, journal access can be difficult. And so thinking about where I publish my work also, you know, some are paywalled. And so there's the limit to reading and to what. And even then thinking of, I mean, just as I've mentioned, Codercia, which opens opportunity for scholars on the continent working on social sciences to be able to publish within their platforms in a in a way that's accessible to other scholars on the continent to be able to read and get in touch with, or keep in touch with current scholarship. And I think lastly, as a researcher, I think being reflexive is quite key. Yeah? Is quite key, even for me as an African who's working on the continent, who's doing my research on the continent. And here I think about what Achimafeche says, for example. And he says, you know, you have to be very self-conscious, and I have to have a self-conscious dialogue and have a dialogue with the person who's being researched, who we talk, I mean, the people where we're researching, so that I remove the premise of inequality of knowledge, you know. And it's not just about Western scholars or scholars from Europe or scholars from Europe or America who have to take the stance and be reflexive about the work, but also those of us from the continent who are doing research, who are doing research, who are living here and doing research on the continent. So I think those are my thoughts. And I think my 10 minutes have gone beyond, I think, by 1 minute. I hope that's fine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marion, for sharing those really insightful reflections. Just to remind everyone, I didn't do so at the beginning. We have 3 questions that we have shared with our speakers. The first one is asking them, looking back, what is their evaluation of the decolonial project in development studies? The second question we have asked them to reflect on is, in their opinion, what are the 3 strategic priorities for a decolonial agenda in development studies, and giving us examples from their specific research area. And then the third question we ask them is, how do they decolonize development studies in practice, in their teaching, and in their research? So thank you so much. We have heard you, Marion. Those are really insightful, food for thought for our next speaker, Puja Jain. Puja.
Hi.
Yes, you're welcome.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, Rama and S.J. Cooper, as I'm really pleased to see you after such a long time. I've never seen your face. And thank you to Mario. So I'll get straight to the 3 questions. I don't have a slide as well, so I'll be pretty much reading my notes, and my responses to the 3 questions that were addressed to the panel are pretty much a rejoinder to what Mario has already said. So when I started reflecting on the whole theme of decolonizing development studies, I, of course, tried to go through the scholarship in it, and there were 2 key moments I identified, past scholars who have challenged the conventional development thinking. So the first ones I thought of were people like Escobar and the whole world system theory that pointed out how development was entrenched in capitalism and exploitation and keeps developing countries in a game which they can never win. And the second one was by people like Peter Owen and James Ferguson, who pointed out that development was a techno-economic enterprise that did not take politics into question. So from this is where I start by answering the question that why is decolonizing development relevant today? Because I think these contestations and questions are pretty much relevant even today. Politics has always been central to the goals of development, the measurement of development, how we evaluate it, and how the outcomes are published. But nonetheless, development continues to be evasive on the question of politics and even history. The power structures, whether it is physical or lexical, they continue to persist and propagate. And similarly, the development project today is absolutely embedded in capitalism, willingly ignorant of the continuous exploitation on which it hinges, whether it is of countries or people who are seen to have lesser social, political, and economic capital than the developed ones. We continue to use a vocabulary that reeks of hierarchy, for example, donor and recipient, and aid, which is devoid of history, devoid of politics and the connotations that these entail, and is devoid also of a sense of dignity and distributive justice. Inequalities within and between countries continue to widen, and mobility of some continue to be constrained. The dichotomy and the valuation that is accorded to trade between commodities and manufactured goods continues to persist, and it continues to keep certain countries unequal. There is hardly any sign of any change. Moreover, just like Mario pointed out, even the so-called all-encompassing and numerous sustainable development goals do not necessarily acknowledge history, diversity, and indigenous knowledge systems in their understanding of sustainable development. So to move on, to identify 3 key strategies to decolonize development, especially with regard to Africa, I began with the usual exercise of asking myself questions, very simple ones. What do I understand by development? Is development really desirable? Does it have to be universal, or should it be specific to context and space? And what is the relationship between time and development? Now, this time factor was brought to my mind because of the numerous instances where I read and heard in conferences, people talking about how Africa was 50 years behind Europe, how Africa today is where China was 20 years ago. So this time factor, I thought, was pretty important in understanding how development is conceived over time. Is it supposed to be a linear process where different countries find themselves in different time zones, and some are apparently eventually trapped in a time zone and can't come out of it? So finally, the most important question was, what do I understand by the term decolonizing development, in order to get to the 3 key points? So I think the development and its decolonization basically entails contesting the whole enterprise, which is supposed to be universal, homogeneous, ahistorical, unequal, territorial, and monodisciplinary. So finally, the key points, there are 3 key points that I identify. One was to change the way we measure development across the world. The second was about questioning the idea of nation state as the geographical unit for development. And the third one was about seeking a counter narrative to the presentism of development. So to come back to changing the way, the first point, the way we measure development, theoretically compartmentalizing and reducing populations to numbers and statistics is something that has been elaborated by a lot of scholars, going back to Foucault's work on biopolitics and governmentality. And I believe that development and the various numbers associated with it are doing pretty much the same thing. So the numbers associated with development aid justify and even moralize the need for external intervention in countries and as systems of rule. The very public and global announcements of aid figures are contradictory to the muted response on the intentions and efficiency of aid. While the amount of aid can be measured and announced, the relationship and the obligations it expects from the recipients cannot be counted. Furthermore, a common yardstick for development, which is measured in statistics, can be very restricting in spite of the practical utility it offers, which I completely understand from the point of view of an economist, but nonetheless, these parameters tend to categorize countries and label them. These labels are sticky, diminishing, and offset other incentives like investments and borrowing in markets, and even the perception and role of the country on the international forum. Most countries in Africa, for instance, are put in the category of the LDCs, the least developed countries, a category which is based on exogenous parameters and definitions of development that come to define them above everything else and robs them of their own agency to create their identity. And talking in terms of international relationships and soft power, it is very debilitating for African countries to have this label attached to them and to exercise their soft power on the international scene. So like Mario, I would argue in favor of an indigenous knowledge system and agency and understanding of what constitutes a good life. A more eclectic, innovative approach, which is bottom-up. Indices like happiness index, for instance, have been around for quite some time. Bhutan has done pretty well based on this index. So to speak, lifespan is only a partial indicator of health and longevity of people, but it does not indicate the quality of life and the social and family network that people benefit of in certain countries in Africa, as was pointed out to me during a conversation by an ambassador from an East African country based in Paris during the coronavirus crisis. So he spoke of something which I see as relational health for people, which cannot be boxed into pieces that, okay, I am someone, I know 5 people, so I am doing better in terms of health. You might put a number on lifespan and longevity, but this is something you can't put a number on. Similarly, in the sustainability discourse, recently I've discovered literature where there's a greater understanding of the indigenous knowledge systems and their relationship with the living world. So we need a non-comparative index that is more representative of the way of living and what people value in life. This brings me to the second line of focus, which is questioning the nation state as the geographical unit of development. Development has been territorialized, demarcated into geographies where people are assumed to be static. Migration, the movement of people as a way of life and the fluidity that it lends to development has been ignored. We need an upheaval of the international visa system and the right to mobility that greatly depends on your citizenship rights, clearly reflective of the continuing colonial power structure. These unequal mobilities very fairly render some people internationally mobile, while others are considered stateless and illegal, and often perceived as a threat to national security, lines along which aid is framed. Furthermore, the concept of nation state explicitly or implicitly comes to refer to race, another derivative of territorialized development and the prejudice that it entails. Visualizing underdevelopment and associating it with the people of a certain color create misrepresentations and racial stigmatization. National development figures selectively and incompletely reflect on the international status of the country and the state of its people. The underdeveloped are infantilized and deprived of agency, a novel approach that engages and recognizes the agency of people and their desire to move and their sense of multiple belongings is something which is needed and it should be integrated in development studies. Against considering static life or non-nomadic life to be the normal state of being. Similarly, poverty can't be boxed into national territory. The epistemology of statistics is diluted by medians and averages. Poor people live in developed countries just as rich people live in poor countries, and this calls for a language on international solidarity and not aid. We use a very different line of argument when we're talking about taxation and when we want to encourage people to pay taxes. And we use a very different language and image when we want to ask people to donate their money as aid to help people who live in distant lands. So this whole idea of taxation and the way it is framed within the boundaries of a nation state so that people have some sort of welfare state and help each other out is very different from the way we categorize people in different countries and we ask for aid using what we call poverty porn and white savior complex, etc. Finally, I seek a counter-narrative to the presentism of development and its ignoring of history. Development in the present, like again Mario said, is shaped by history and who narrated it. Historical and pre-colonial evidence of development in today's underdeveloped countries need to be brought to fore in order to understand development before it was framed in the present form. Narratives from the past narratives from the past can actually inform strategies in the developed world of today, battling with climate change, for instance. Understanding colonization and its impact on both countries and colonizers will lend insight into the trajectories which were followed in order to achieve development, the ethicality of the means in order to achieve this idealistic end. Studying the history of how nation states were carved in Africa is also extremely important. And here, I think the idea of governmentality and the forms of rule, as I came across the works of Partha Chatterjee, were very interesting, where he talks about how in colonial states, I mean, the countries that were colonized, you had a system of rule and governmentality before the nation state actually came into being, or an identification through the idea, unlike how Western states were conceived, as Charles Tilly and others and Weber speak of. The existence of pre-colonial history is important in reframing development studies. A reverse chronology of climate change indicators, for example, would reflect on a more sustainable past and a more underdeveloped present. And in my view, from what I've been seeing in the debates in France, for instance, I think the repatriation of artwork and the works of scholars from Senegal, like Felville Sarr, who've been working on this subject, are very important in restoring and are a small step forward in restoring history and dignity. And similarly, the discovering of the Benin city, which stands in ruins today, and how mathematically and organized it was before it got destroyed by colonizers who did not understand it, I think are narratives which go into feed a conception of development, which is not how we understand it today, and changes the narrative of how Africa or colonized countries are perceived as continents of darkness, which was enlightened by the colonizers. We need to change how we think and do development. We need methodologies that reflect indigenous knowledge systems and agency, and are more specific to history, context, and space. And we also need new forms of governmentality and rules which are more participatory in nature and more progressive and evolving with the people who seek that governmentality and participate in it. To close my note, I'll share my experiences and views on steps to be taken to decolonize the way we teach development. So I teach development at Sciences Po to undergraduate students who are in their second year, third year. And like Mario, I mean, it's pretty strange how we all come to the same points, but one of the first things I noticed was that we were constantly consulting articles which were published and journals which were published in the UK or the USA, even though there might be scholars who were people of different origins, but nonetheless, the publications always came from UK and USA. So it was important to sensitize students to the idea of whose voice is heard. And if it is not heard, why? It's not because of the lack of expertise or knowledge system, but it's simply because people there do not have the libraries which give them the access to numerous scholars and journals. That literature is, of course, the access is much more limited as compared to someone sitting in Sciences Po might have. So it was important to understand the access to resources, who gets to publish in the journals, and what kind of journals we can in future consult, which reflect a more indigenous knowledge system and knowledge in progress. Secondly, it's something very simplistic, but then second, third year students often tend, when they do their PowerPoint presentations, would often use images which are very reflective of so-called the white savior complex. And then you have to point it out to them that this is not how things are done. You have to sensitize them and why this is problematic. It's also to make them aware of the fact that development is not a business in ideals and morals, but it has a history, it has geopolitical and economic and cultural context, which are extremely important. And of course, encouraging students to ask uncomfortable questions and critically engage in development studies. But most importantly, I believe that all these strategies should be actually a part of the strategies that we speak of and the other speakers will be speaking of today. They should be part of school curriculum rather than waiting for people to come as graduates and undergraduates in, I don't know, universities which are paid and expensive. I think it's important that children who go to school come out as informed adults in society and do not reproduce the same cliches and prejudices as was taught to them by their parents, their families, and society in general. So it should be part of the school curriculum. I mean, at least like where I stay in France, I hardly see any school-going child who's remotely aware of what colonization was, except the Rayonnement de France and stuff like that. So it's something extremely important. And finally, just like people like Andreas Cornwall and Mario suggested, a more radical approach would be to completely give up the whole idea of development studies and move to more other departments like anthropology, history, or geography, which might be able to address this whole question of the quality and way of life in better and more equal and space and context specific ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Puja. I have been taking notes during your whole presentation. Thank you so much for these insights. I will be summarizing your main point soon. So now let me introduce Rotel Nijay for her presentation. And apologies, Rotel will have to leave after sharing her contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rama and SJ and the University of Edinburgh, as well as the DSA for launching this study group. I think it's a really important initiative and I wish you all the best of luck in propelling it forward. So I'm gonna make my remarks very, very brief, primarily because I have to hop off very quickly, but also because I cede any extra comments or time to Prof. Sabelo in honor of you, Prof. So in terms of what is my evaluation of the decolonial project, I think the decolonial project in development studies has not sufficiently addressed race. Now I want to preface this by saying that if anybody has heard my DSA keynote last year, I apologize, this is going to be a repeat. But I think fundamentally development is structured along hierarchies of race and place, but there are glaring silences on race and racism, not only in the scholarship and the policy, but also in the practice. And I think fundamentally the silence around race and development allows Western practitioners and scholars of development to avoid being accountable for the powers as well as the privileges that derive from whiteness. This is an argument that Uma makes in her really important seminal text, 2006, Progress in Development Studies. Now, what's interesting is that while global domination and structural inequalities are constituted effectively by economic power, they're really reinforced and justified by racial power. This is an argument that Cedric Robinson made in his really important seminal text in 1983 called Black Marxism. It's an argument that Kalpana Wilson makes in her 2012 important book, Race, Racism, and Development. Now, I think in terms of the 3 strategic priorities, I'd probably come up with 4. The first is fundamentally, we have to mainstream race as an anti-racist agenda for development, as a discipline and also as a policy and a practice. In the same way that Marxist and feminist scholars have mainstream class and gender respectively, because I think analyzing race forces us to see development in quotation marks as a global challenge, right? Not solely the predicament of the so-called global South. Because we know that people of color experience limited statehood and material deprivation and grinding poverty, as well as inequality in the global North at alarming rates in the same way they do in the so-called global South, an argument that Amartya Sen makes in his 1999 book, Development as Freedom. And we can see this contemporarily in the Black Lives Matter global protests against structural as well as physical violence. And as well as in examples of COVID-19, which we've seen, people of color being disproportionately impacted by the public health emergency in the global South, as well as in the so-called global North. Now, these are glaring examples of why it's important to mainstream race. Another strategic priority that I think is incredibly important is that we really, as scholars primarily, we really need to figure out a way to connect the epistemic decolonization movement or effort or project with social justice movements across the so-called global South, particularly in the continent of Africa, right? We need to take decolonization outside of the ivory tower and into policy and practice. So while we argue for the importance of epistemic freedom, political decolonization is not yet complete. I don't know if many of you are aware, but there is an island called Chagos Island, which is off the coast of Mauritius, which has been fighting for its self-rule and its self-determination for decades, right? So when Mauritius gained independence from the UK in 1968, the UK unlawfully held on to Chagos Island and deported its inhabitants off the island. And these inhabitants are called Chagosians, in order to lease this island to the US as a military base. Now, Chagosians, again, have been fighting for the right to return to the island since then. Now, the ICJ, the International Court for Justice, ruled on February 25th, 2019, that the UK must relinquish Chagos and return it to Mauritius. But the Chagosians also want their own sort of self-rule and self-determination from Mauritius as well as from the UK. The UK refuses to respect the advisory position of the ICJ, and they say that it's not legally binding. So we talk about epistemic decolonization, but political decolonization in this very specific example, in this contemporary example, absolutely is not complete, right? I think a third strategic priority that I would stress is that we need to completely change the lexicon of development, because we need to acknowledge that the challenges of socioeconomic transformation in the so-called global South, we need to speak about these issues in a way that is respectful and dignified of the people in which we're discussing. And last but certainly not least, I think development studies needs an interdisciplinary specific ethical guidelines to avoid extractivism and exploitation. The field, both policy practice and then also scholarship, is about extracting, taking resources, taking knowledge, taking ideas, and then running to the so-called global north and using the knowledge, the ideas, the processes, the policies for our own sort of professional advancement. And I think that that's incredibly unethical, right? So what do we do? I think one of the things we need to do is to require scholars to return the analysis back to the informants that they consulted and to the fieldwork sites that they worked in for engagement as well as critique. Now, how do I personally decolonize development studies in my practice? Through my teaching as well as my research in a number of ways. I think in my research, one of the things that I do in terms of just centering is investigating how taken for granted development interventions are contested. In my research, I also excavate the work of what Indian activist and author calls the deliberately silenced as well as the preferably unheard. These critical scholars and thinkers from the so-called global South who many of you probably don't know about. So for instance, Cedric Robertson, who is somebody that I talk about ad nauseum, wrote a book called Black Marxism, and he coined the term racial capitalism. This phrase is used quite extensively, but people don't give him credit where credit is due. Another scholar, Liberian scholar by the name of Clarence E. Zamba Liberty is somebody that I reference quite extensively in my work on Liberia. And he wrote a really important book in 1977 called The Growth of the Liberian State. This is, in my humble opinion, this is the seminal text in Liberia's state formation. But many scholars who write about Liberia, who theorize about Liberia, don't even cite this really important text. So I'm very, very committed to the process of excavating the work of these so-called forgotten scholars from the so-called global South and the continent of Africa as well. In my teaching, what I do is I emphasize how students' lived experiences represent sites of knowledge production and theory building, right? What's become my pedagogical Bible is a book by Bell Hooks called Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom. And what she argues is that the classroom should be a safe space for not only teachers, but also students to transgress racist, sexist, and classist boundaries, what she calls the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Another thing that I do in my teaching is I use multiple non-scholarly sources and texts and images. So not just relying on books that have been published in the so-called global North, but also things like podcasts, right? Things like novels, things like blogs, music lyrics are things that I often reference and use in my classroom teaching. I use photographs, again, to deconstruct development and its sort of visual representation. I use news clippings as an exercise that I ask students to do is beyond the classroom, how do you find current affairs news items and bring them to the classrooms to talk about how development is in every single facet of human life, right? It's reflected in the way we talk about development and we talk about people from the so-called global South in news reportage. I also use films in my classroom to deconstruct what knowledge looks like and whose knowledge is valued and important. So I'll end there and say, again, thank you for the invitation. I apologize that I have to leave early, but I look forward to seeing the recording and I know it's gonna be a really fruitful discussion. Thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Rotel, for these very rich reflections. Sad that you will not be there for the Q&A, but thank you so much. We will share the recording later. Now I will hand over to Dr. Hazel Gray for her presentation.
Thanks, Rama, and thanks, SJ, for hosting this event. I think it's a really important event and it's a real honor to be here. Thanks to everyone who's spoken before me. I'm lucky to be fourth in, so I could listen to all of that and nod and really enjoy and appreciate everything that has been said so far. I'd also like to recognize the work of Zoe Marks in setting up the Decolonising Working Group at CAS. So much has been said about decolonising development, and yet there's still so much left to be said. And I'm going to talk about some very narrow points here. I want to emphasize certain tensions within the discussion about decolonising development. Firstly, around globality, around interdisciplinarity. And I want to make some points about the coloniality of mainstream economics and how that leads to continued coloniality within development studies. And finally, responding to the questions that we were given to answer I want to give some reflections on my own role as a white mid-career female academic, in particular on the role of administration that academics play and what that can do to act in solidarity with agendas of decolonizing. So my broad argument I'm going to try and make in the next 10 minutes is that while specific projects of decolonizing are achievable within development studies, the backdrop of a constantly changing relationship between racism, racialization, and capitalism means that the prospects of a genuinely decolonized development studies are far from being realized. And indeed, we're not sure what this would look like. And this is why a working group chaired by Rama is such an exciting prospect. There's a lot of work to be done in this area. While I would say that the decolonizing agenda has had no or really very little impact on the aid industrial complex, decolonial approaches have had a large influence in certain areas of development studies and draw on important decolonial thinking of Latin American thinkers and scholars and African scholars. It's hard to say how far this agenda has penetrated across the different working groups of the DSA, but I was interested to note that on the website of the DSA, it now explains that, and this is in quotes, historically our focus was on poorer countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This now extends to development issues worldwide. So this is a kind of shift that's happened in the framing of development that's been mentioned by speakers that preceded me, reflecting a shift in the framing of development from this kind of north-south binary to a set of global challenges. And this language of global challenges and the idea of global challenges as a development challenge has been taken up in the international development architecture of the SDGs, etc. And my concern here is that, while that is laudable and an improvement rather than having a north-south binary, we shouldn't take this global development as being a framing that is in itself a way of decolonizing. In that sense, we should definitely look back to important scholars. Rotel also already mentioned Frederick Robinson, and I would quote here from Bhattacharya, who point out the ongoing role of racialized dispossession that shape economic life. And that's, I'm concerned about the flattening that happens in the framing of development around global development challenges. Given that the attention to variation is key, what inequalities and what racial inequalities will go unseen in this reframing? My second point is really about interdisciplinarity. So a really key feature of development studies as it's taught in the UK and is central to the DSA is this idea of a commitment to interdisciplinarity. So interdisciplinarity is often held up as a good in and of itself, as a way of overcoming the coloniality inherent in all of our academic disciplines. And I suppose it should be said at first that all of the disciplines that make up development studies have been implicated in projects of colonialism and imperialism. In the same way that there are no innocent methods of research, archival research, ethnography, econometrics have all been implicated in projects of colonialism and neocolonialism in various ways. So not to make an argument against interdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity can take us forward to recognizing the value of what Haraway calls situated knowledge. But I think that there's a concern about the role of interdisciplinarity in development studies, which is that we need to recognize how the kind of common canon of development studies that is taught all over the UK draws on an interdisciplinarity which has allowed coloniality to persist within development studies. And I think this is quite insidious. This is not the same type of coloniality, the more blatant and egregious form of coloniality that was seen, for example, in the Third World Quarterly paper justifying and defending colonialism that caused outright and very justified outrage when it was published. But what I'm talking about is the kind of insidious coloniality of mainstream economics. So, I think that there is a lot to be done about thinking through the place of economics within development studies and what kind of ideas about the economy that we draw from. And ideas about the economy are really, that are dominant within development studies very much are confined by mainstream economics, and draw from an underlying neoclassical model of methodological individualism, methodological optimization, and the counterfactual of the perfect market as an ideal. And all of these, you could say, are kind of myth-making of capitalism. They present a form of market that doesn't rely on forms of violence or dispossession. And I think that, you know, the popular canon of development that crosses over between scholarship and kind of the bestseller lists that you get sold in bookshops in the high street draws from, is particularly popular because it's quite tractable and understandable. It doesn't rely on highly mathematical approach to mainstream economics, but it makes a set of arguments about colonialism and development that have become incredibly popular. I'm talking here about the work of people like Douglas North, Ashimoglu and Robinson, Paul Collier, etc. And it's important really to kind of render transparent their coloniality, because they place colonial history as very central in explaining paths of economic change. You know, what they're basically saying is that the colonial intervention caused inequality, but was overcome by subsequent capitalist development. So in a sense, you know, the problems of capitalism are overcome by more capitalism. The trouble with this is, you know, as I've argued elsewhere, that it reduces violence to a form of transaction cost, which can then makes invisible the kind of continuation of violence that occurs in our world today, and how violence is still linked to accumulation and capitalist accumulation. So, I mean, these popular canon within development studies hides the relationship between racism and class and systems of accumulation. And given the importance of the place of the economy in human well-being, I don't really see how we can move forward with an agenda of decolonizing development studies on these very shaky foundations, because we foreclose debates about the future, and we foreclose drawing on other ideas about how the economy could be structured. And here in particular, you know, in my own work, I've been very influenced by thinkers such as Thandika Mkandawire, and also Nyerere's original thought. In a way, his thoughts about the place of human development predate Amartya Sen, and perhaps are more political and fulfilling than some of Amartya Sen's arguments. But the other danger with this invisibility of the economic model that underpins mainstream development studies is that these approaches reaffirm the ideals of limited state interventions, free market competitions, and undermine alternative approaches to economic transformation and property rights. So this is particularly important to recognize at this moment of crystallization, both of a kind of movement towards decolonization, but also a crystallization of the power of the private sector that's supposedly meant to deliver this global development agenda. You know, the extent to which the private sector and business solution, entrepreneurship, corporate social responsibility are presented as the way forward in global development. But what we don't then study is how these new variations of racial capitalism are linked to different strategies of accumulation through these modes of delivery of development. So as I said at the beginning, what the argument I wanted to make was that specific projects of decolonizing development studies are achievable within limits, but against a backdrop where the place of race and racism in capitalism and capitalist accumulation is changing and not diminishing. So how does development studies as an area within academia in the UK, but also within a broader network of thinking about development, seek to overcome some of these limitations? But I think we just need to be, development studies overall needs to be much more upfront about the agendas of economic transformations and the political projects it's attached to. And in order to do that, there needs to be a much more explicit recognition of the imaginaries that it relies on. And these imaginaries, if they're really going to be anti-racist, need to be anti-capitalist and anti-racist together. One doesn't achieve the other. So, I mean, it's not that I think that development studies is going to produce these manifestos for change. That's going to happen elsewhere. These are the kind of things which are happening right now in processes of struggle and in different forms of cultural production that are so rich and so important and flourishing even in these very harsh times. But those in development studies need to really then be much more clear about where their ideological commitments lie. And I think that, you know, Rama's group here has a really important role in fostering this dialogue about the relationship between racism, capitalism, and development. So finally, just in these last few minutes then, I want to talk about my role as a white mid-career academic in the broader agendas of decolonizing development studies. And I mean, as I've come to this point now, after many years in contemporary contracts, and finally find myself in this different position of being seen as a, you know, now a kind of relatively stable mid-career academic with a growing admin role. I think that, you know, as a white person and white people in development studies need to do the work on recognizing their own privileges and biases and the racism that we all end up perpetuating unintentionally, and many of the actions that we take unintentionally. So, you know, we just need to do the work. White people in development studies need to do this work. And this is not about REF or impact studies, or it's not either about being an expert on race. It's not something that you can exempt yourself from at the moment. It's an absolute key necessity that we should all undertake. And I think that overall, I mean, white people in positions of authority need to be much better at listening to our colleagues who are racialized. I mean, there are contested terms, all of these terms are contested, BME, POC, but what we need to ask ourselves, white people in development studies need to ask themselves and listen to where they need to stand back to create space, where they need to lift people up, and where they need to stand forward to share the load of anti-racist work which falls so heavily on our racialized colleagues. And there's no manual on how to do this. A lot of the times, although there's a general, you know, there are the structural conditions which lead to these inequalities, a lot of the decisions about what kind of space you can create depend on various forms of micropolitics that require constant reflection and constant listening. And at this moment, you know, we need to act in solidarity and in support and with an ethic of care at this moment, but also when the cameras roll on and the newspapers move on to other things, and when the chancellors of our universities are no longer worried about kind of bad publicity they might get, we need to keep on doing this work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hazel, for reminding us of the importance to hold space, not only for care, but also for radical solidarities. So now let me hand over to Professor Sabelo Gacheny. Prof, you have 10 minutes. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, colleagues. It's very difficult to say anything when you become the last speaker, because so much has been said, which I agree with. And I think I must then try to focus perhaps on one issue as an addition to what the colleagues have just said. And that is the epistemic question in development. And I come to that question because here at the University of Bayreuth, I teach a course on knowledge in development studies. And in that course, the attempt is really to underscore the role of knowledge in creating reality. And also to perhaps argue that what we are dealing with today as the question of development, as an idea, as a discourse, as an ideology, or as a concept, or as a practice, might actually be better understood as an epistemic creation. And when we argue that way, we will also perhaps argue that the modern world itself is an epistemic creation, and what exists as economies, as society, as politics, are actually framed by epistemic thought. And when we argue this way, we will therefore perhaps also then think about decolonization in terms of understanding that knowledge which is weaved around such concepts as development. And perhaps also think perhaps about the whole issue of what is generally called the development impulse or the development crisis as perhaps fundamentally an epistemic crisis. And if this is a viable a way of thinking about decolonizing development, then perhaps we start with what the colleagues have already flagged in various ways. Thinking about the very concept of development. Why is it that we all agree that the term is dirty? We agree that it carries a white gaze on the world, but at the same time, we're finding it difficult to abandon the term itself. In fact, even the development agencies, they always epocally come with development reports, which after a decade are proven not to work. And what they do, instead of abandoning questioning the whole idea of development, they actually add adjectives to the concept of development. Either they then say, no, let's think about it as sustainable development. Let's think about it as local development. Let's think about it. They always add adjectives as part and parcel of refusing to actually abandon the concept. And as I was thinking about the term itself, I thought about the legacy of Marcus Garvey, particularly his association, the Negro Improvement Association. But Marcus Garvey avoided deliberately that concept of development, and they spoke about improvement. And that becomes an important concept in the sense that every society self-improve over time across space and time. And that you can then link with the work of Julius Nyerere, who has been spoken about here, who then added the idea of self-reliance, how all human beings and the societies always self-improved across time using their own agents, resources, and if you like, native intelligence. I think this might be actually an important entry point because, as colleagues have already emphasized, that there is need for us to bring historicity or history into the debates on development. And if we do that, we'll find that development cannot be actually be a cargo which comes from somewhere into other spaces. The real concern when we're thinking about this issue of self-improvement is to study how people in different spaces and in different environments used their own intelligence to self-improve. And you think about how the people in the Egyptian civilization used the Nile River to build that Egyptian civilization. You can think about how Africans thought about a shift from stone tools to iron tools, the domestication of plants and all that. And I'm raising this not only because I'm a historian coming into development, but because I'm also worried about the current rendition even of technological change in terms of fourth industrial revolution, that there were only four revolutions. What about the other revolutions which took place in the Nile River, for instance, and they produced the Egyptian civilization? What about the civilization, the technological changes from iron tools from stone tools to iron tools? Why is that left out as though the only change actually came during the encounter with Europe? And I think if we think that way, therefore we will abandon the whole cargo mentality, which Ibekwe Chinwenzu speak about, which is a problem in development. And if we think that way, perhaps we might also come closer to Semia Amini's concept of delinking, founded on a strategic privileging of internal imperative and internal histories, without necessarily degenerating into ghettoization and cutting ourselves from the world. But still pursuing this question of the epistemological issues, I think another way of dealing with the decolonizing development is to actually think about decolonizing the canon or the normative conceptual foundations of development thought itself. And in order to do so, I think we have also some works which already exist in that area, which assist us in thinking through that. Such works as the, by Claude Ake, Social Sciences Imperialism, the Theory of Political Development, as old as 1979, or Katharina Odora Hopper's and Richard Howard's book, Rethinking Thinking, Modernity's Other and the Transformation of the University, or most recently, Amy Allen's book, The End of Progress, Decolonizing the Normative Foundation of Critical Theory, which actually further emboldened me to think about the need to rethink and even to unthink thinking itself on what has come to be known as development. And what does this mean practically? It means, therefore, we delink mentally from the Euro-modernity paradigm of difference, which actually creates these old dichotomies and binaries of primitive, modern, barbaric, civilized, developed, underdeveloped. It practically means we must also unlearn the Enlightenment linear ideas, where development is actually where the idea of development occupies a central place. I'm thinking of Enlightenment ideas of salvation, civilization, progress, modernity, modernization, then development, then emancipation. We need to, as we think the theory, to think deeply about that one. And if you read the work of Amy Allen, for instance, she actually wrote eloquently about how even the respected school, the Frankfurt School, because of its entrapment in Enlightenment linear thinking, it actually even saw imperialism and colonialism as part of progress and development. And perhaps it also, I think Hazel Gray has already spoken about it, it also means taking seriously Samia Amin's warning about the limits of classical economic thought and its irrelevancies. Practically, it also means that we take cognizance of the fact that capitalism as a mode of production and a world economic system had the potential to create its own cognitive needs, including creating disciplines such as economics that privilege measurements, quantification, and the externalization, if not objectification, of what is knowable with respect to the knower, so as to control the relations among people and nature. And I was thinking perhaps one of the arguments which I can put forward is therefore that what has been imposed on the world under the banner of development can actually be described as the poverty of thought, which then open floodgates to material poverty itself. And thinking from a university, I thought it would be important for us to then think very deeply about why is it that we are rather timid or we fear really abandoning the term development itself. And why is it that even the development agencies, the thinkers even from the global south, they still go back to this idea of speaking about development, which actually there seem to be a consensus even here that it is a dirty word. And if it is a dirty word, why do we fear to really challenge it? And I want to end by saying, where I'm based now at the University of Bayreuth, I think the attempt has been to move and think outside the disciplines. And that's why the chair which I'm holding here is actually a chair in epistemologies of the global south. And because of its nomenclature and its naming, it is not located in any discipline. So what I do practically, I seem to be teaching across so many fields. As I said, I teach the MA in development studies, and I teach knowledge into that. And then also I teach into global history, and I teach a seminar on empire, colonialism, and decolonization. And then I also teach into anthropology, and I teach liberation movements and the post-colonial orders in Southern Africa. And that way, I find I'm more freer to really rethink so many things, unlike to be confined to the disciplines. Rama, I'm always very undisciplined. I didn't follow the logic of your questions, but I think I responded to all of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for these insights. I think I have thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and would like to thank you all. Sarah Jane, I think we agree that this was a very rich panel. And just to recapitulate some of the key ideas that have emerged here, Marion, who is in social policy, has shared her views on the need to go beyond economicist conceptualization of development. She has, for instance, given taken the specific case of the RCTs, randomized control trials, regarding the three priorities that she has identified. The first one for her would be to ground the knowledge we produce in our local context. Then we need to rethink what alternatives exist to what we are being sold. And finally, she's urging us to abandon the whole development agenda as it stands, with reference to the Sustainable Development Goals. So in her final words, she has also urged us to rethink whose work we are drawing on, the politics of citation, and also to make our research available to the very people who have informed it. Secondly, we have had a very insightful presentation from Puja, who has started by questioning and interrogating the vocabulary of donor-recipient relations. She had really framed development as an unequal exchange. I think that was un clin d'œil à Samir Amin, Puja, but she has asked us to rethink how do we build on indigenous methodologies? How do we contest the ahistorical, monodisciplinary, territorial conceptualization of development? For her, there are three priorities. The first one would be to contest the mainstream instruments we use to measure development. Secondly, she urges us to think beyond the nation state. And finally, she is also asking us to actively seek a counter narrative to development presentism. Thirdly, we have heard from Rotel Nijay Pele, who has first encouraged us to mainstream race as a discipline, as a policy, and as a practice. Secondly, she has also one key point she has identified is the unfinished business of political development, not only the epistemic challenge, but also political decolonization. The third point she has shared is about interdisciplinarity and the need to have an agenda against a research agenda that wouldn't be extractivist and unequal and unethical. And this can be done through sharing knowledge back to those who have informed our research. And I think she echoes Marion in this point, and also Puja. She also asked us to use in our research multiple non-scholarly sources to bridge the gap between theory and practice. We have also heard from Hazel Gray, for whom the decolonial development project is achievable, but within limits. For her, this is because of the very interdisciplinary and also insidious colonialism and coloniality of development studies, because all of the disciplines that make development studies are inherently built on a colonial an imperial legacy. So she has taken the specific case study of economics because she's an economist, but I would also like to add the discipline of anthropology, which is the handmaiden of colonialism. And I think any other discipline we might refer to here would also, this critique would be relevant. And her third point was regarding racial capitalism and the need to decolonize our imaginaries for them not only to be anti-racist, but also anti-capitalist. And on a more friendly note, or on a more self-centered note, she has also urged us to hold space and center care and radical solidarities in our decolonial practice. And finally, I think Prof. Sabelo has really summed it up and brought all the initial thoughts together by relinking the question of epistemic decolonization with that of political decolonization, but he goes even beyond that. He's very subversive and urges us to go beyond the disciplines, beyond think ourselves outside of the disciplines, and taking into account that if we historicize development and if we historicize all the disciplines that make development, we are faced with the poverty of the development thought. And then decolonizing would be possible if we think outside of our disciplinary boundaries. And thank you so much, Prof. So thanks to all our speakers. I would now like to hand over to Sarah Jane Kupanak, who will be chairing the Q&A session. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And just to echo my thanks for all of the insights that we've had so far from all of our panelists. So we've had 4 questions through, which I think the best thing is probably to group them together. Some of them are more specific, some of them are more general. And then we can pass the mic between the panelists. Let's do it in the same kind of the same order that we had everyone speaking in the first time, and we can hear your thoughts on the questions that you find resonate most strongly. So the first question we had was a question around how global organizations focused on development issues such as global health could practically engage with decolonization of development within their work. The second question was directed to Marion, but I think open for anybody who wants to have a reply, which is that Marion had mentioned rethinking or abandoning the SDGs. And do we have a suggestion for their replacement, or do we think that they should not be replaced at all? The third question was around the parameters of politics and engagement with development studies. So in critically engaging with development studies as an idea which is important, what are the views of scholars here about practical initiatives in addressing real issues here and now? Are we doing away with these whilst we're arguing for decolonizing development studies, or are we to engage with ethically engaged development work? And the fourth one, which I'm slipping in because I'm really excited to hear your perspectives, is just to pick up on Marion's point and also Hazel's point around the question of political imagination and its importance for decolonizing development. And I would just love to hear who has been really influential in your lives and your journeys in helping you to expand your political imaginations. So with that, I will hand over first to Marion, and then we'll go through the panelists in order. Just to let everyone in the audience know, we will just be borrowing a little more of your time until 1:45 to finish this discussion off. If you can't stay, that's absolutely fine. We totally understand, and we will be sharing the recording through the mailing list for the DSA Decolonising Working Group. The link to sign up to that mailing list is on the public chat. So over to you, Marion.
Yeah. I think I'll make an attempt at the first 2 questions, and I think my my fellow colleagues then will have a look at them. I think, I mean, coming from having worked in international organizations, global organizations on development, I think the first way of decolonizing these spaces is in the recruitment process, yeah? And how staffing and the way staffing looks, you know. And most of the time for these global corporations and global organizations, you have the international office, which is mostly based in Europe or America, you know, and then you have the local offices that are dotted around the continent, for example. And what happens is you have differences in even the level of pay and the level of benefits that the different categories of the way the staff is categorized. And those who are based in what is called the international office are called international staff. But then those who are based in the national offices are called national staff. And there's actually a huge discrepancy in even huge discrepancy in pay, a huge discrepancy in the benefits and everything. But also most of the time it's assumed that if you work in the international office, and this we've talked about knowledge, it's assumed that if you work in the international office, then you're more knowledgeable than even the ones who are working on what is in the national offices. And therefore it's a hierarchy of work that then places those within the international office, who then most of the time happen to be white, the issue of race, at a higher level than those who work at national level, though those who work at national level have the knowledge that is required, the same kind of knowledge or even more knowledgeable. But also I think we have to think about location. Why would you locate an office in Geneva and 90% of your work is in Kenya, for example? What's the sense of that? Why, you know, we have to think about the issue of location, because location also matters in terms of staffing. Because people who work, people from maybe local people cannot get a visa work permit to work in Geneva. And so even location matters. And so this is some of the things that have to be thought about in terms of decolonizing these spaces. The SDGs, and I'm not just talking about abandoning the SDGs alone, but I think it's abandoning the whole ideology, the grand ideologies of development, and these fixed models that we have, yeah. And the SDGs is just one of them. And honestly, I wouldn't. I think when we say, is there an alternative? It's and I think then I would what Professor Sabelo has said is, what happens is you have a model and then it then stifles imagination within a country like ours, for example, in Kenya. You know, what happens is you don't create space when you have a model that then you impose on our people, then it leaves no room and it leaves very little space for imagination of other alternatives. And if probably they're abandoned, for example, if the SDGs are abandoned, there are alternatives that we've had on the continent before. And we have to think even after independence, post-independence, and you look at what is classified as development post-independence, and you look at what we have now. Then before the structural adjustment programs, there was imagination. There was imagination and imagination of human welfare and human well-being. Prof. Sabelo has mentioned Julius Nyerere. There was imagination that was coming. There was the nationalist movement, you know, and people thinking about the welfare and the well-being of citizens. And so I would still urge for an abandonment of all these ideologies, the grand ideologies that we are sold, because it's just a stifling of imagination and reimagination and re-theorizing of alternatives that could be available. Yeah. Okay, I think that's it for me.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Ratma, I love your applause emojis. So Puja, can I pass the mic to you?
Thank you. think I noted all the questions in the right order, but the first one, how can global organizations engage in decolonization? I think the first one would be to seek it. You have to actually look for it, as we see in the panel, that things like this exist and have existed, like I pointed out, with the world system theory and the works of development scholars and people who actually worked in organizations and then worked as academics, like Stiglitz and William Easterly, people who were working in the bank, and they write very different accounts of their experiences when they're out of the bank. So I think one of the important points is to actually get a voice in these organizations, so that if they don't want to engage, we get them engaged, to help them sponsor panels like this, so that they are also able to take something out of it. I think that will be one step to do that. You have to seek the knowledge, if you really want to understand something and apply it. And that brings me to a more related but question about practical suggestions about doing. I think some of the practical suggestions is what, like Mario has been talking about, like the physical location of organizations and the staffing and the knowledge that they produce, everything that is entailed by these geographical limitations and choices is something extremely important. And then, yeah, like I said, like a small country like Bhutan has come up with its happiness index. And so I think indigenous knowledge systems and way of, I guess, measuring or quantifying things which is understandable to people is something that needs to be explored. And statistics itself and numbers itself are not something objective. They have their own anthropology and their ethnography, and these are things I think that we need to really bring to fore, and it's probably a subject that can be explored in a next continuing panel of this one that we had today. And another one would be the visa system. I think it is extremely important to do so, because when I was traveling and I went to Senegal, and I just found it extremely, extremely strange and unfair that, I might have spent time in prison in France, but I can still travel to Senegal without any problem. And I might be a PhD student, I might be a doctor even, but I can't travel to France without a visa. And my visa can be rejected on completely flimsy terms. And I really have to be on good terms with the people who's sitting on the window, because of his own personal judgment, he might refuse my visa. So I think it's extremely important for the physical flow of people. You cannot discover an island or discover America or discover India or anything if you're not allowed to travel. You cannot report on poverty in France or how people of color are treated there if you're not allowed to go there as a journalist. So I think this whole idea of mobility is extremely important. And because it really gives you a power to narrate, because you see it, but I can't see it. And so I can't have any narrative on something which I'm not allowed to see. So this, I think, is something, the right to travel and right to movement, it's something that international organizations need to look on. The UN meets every year. And I think it's something they should talk about. It's so, historically also, it's so unfair. We would not have had any colonization if we had a visa system then. We would have not let those people come in. So it's very unfair to subject people to a certain form of colonization and exploitation and extraction. And then after that, develop visa systems so that these very same people cannot come where we went. So I think this is a practical suggestion for me, which is extremely important. And a bit controversial perhaps, but I think it's really needed. It's very unfair and unequal. And thirdly, the question asked by Sarah Jane about the physical location, about the practical imagination, political imagination, the personal experience. I think my imagination was very limited because I was growing up as a child in India, staying with my grandparents. It really expanded once I started traveling and studying more and more, because you can't be on a panel if you're just doing your master's. You need to do PhD and you need to be working in a university, etc. So you get your voice heard the more you study, you know. So that's how, by meeting people while I traveled and by being on panels like this, that my political imagination started to expand. And that's how I understood race. I understood how race is reproduced in my own country against people of other color. I understood how India was racist and religiously discriminatory while I stayed in France. And I did not understand race as racism really well until unless I married a Frenchman, and I realized how differently people were treating me and him, because things in France can be so latent that you really don't understand what's happening. And that's when I started understanding, okay, so it's hard to express it because in English you only have you, but in French, like, you have tu and you have vous. So he would be a vous, but I would be a tu. And so if I call a doctor to treat my children, the doctor would not let me question and not let me answer my questions, and is suddenly all smiles when my husband walks in. So it's extremely humiliating, and that's why you are instigated and to really understand that my voice matters and I have to react, because people who do not have a master's, do not have a PhD, their voices cannot be heard. And that's why I take responsibility to voice the opinions and challenges of people whose voices are not heard as much as mine. So I think I've become much more responsible being here, which I wasn't earlier.
Thank you so much, Puja, for those reflections. Really, really important points being made there as well. Hazel, can I pass to you now? I realise we are running out of time again, but I would just love to hear from both of our last panelists.
I'll be very short. I think that there's two things which I'll just answer very, very quickly. So one of the questions was about what should we do, practical issues rather than the kind of critical perspectives, what can be done. I mean, I think there is not this dichotomy between being practical and dealing with the issues that we are confronted with and thinking critically. We don't leave our critical functions at the door. We need to bring those with us into our workplaces and daily interactions and apply those to what might appear to be ethically engaged development work, but just to keep on seeking to have better answers. And then, you know, in terms of political imaginaries, I always remember reading Buli Wationgo's book Petals of Blood when I was in my early 20s, and what a big influence that had on me on understanding the process of capitalist development. And when he came to Edinburgh, was it last year now, he came to Edinburgh to receive an honorary doctorate, and I asked him about it, and he said he had been really influenced by dependency theory in writing that book. So I always recommend that to my students as a way of engaging with political imaginaries and economic imaginaries as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hazel. Prof, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Always very bad in responding to questions. So I will actually respond rather than answering. I think the first one on global organizations, I think the quick response there will be that for them to be effective, I think they must really be true partners with those people who are actually experiencing poverty, deprivation, and the lack of progress. Instead of adopting the civilizing mission, a type of approach, I think that way they will be more effective. And this has been said over and over, but it needs to be repeated. Then the second issue which needs to be taken into account related to that is that the people who are said to be poor or underdeveloped are people who actually have their own knowledge, who know what is troubling them. And the more we listen to them than thinking for them, the better. And they know what needs to change. And this takes me to the third point, that perhaps what is lacking in most of the global south particularly is social and economic justice rather than the issue of charity, that they need to be developed by somebody from somewhere. Then perhaps the other, I respond to the one on replacing SDGs. I think that's a broader question, not about the SDGs per se, but I think is a broader question about shifting from the colonizers model of the world, as James Blount will put it, and beginning to think about perhaps what will another world look like, and what will be the values which are underpinning that world, which is different from the colonizers model of the world, where there is race, where there is this whole issue of capitalism determining everything. And that would be, then the last one, in terms of who influenced. I won't answer it in terms of being influenced by a person, but being born in the Southern African region, where there were secular colonial regimes and where there was also armed liberation struggles. My consciousness actually and the imagination comes from that experience of people fighting for freedom, and that it has actually shaped my own thinking in the academy. Thank you.
Wonderful points. Thank you so much, Prof. And that brings us to the end of our round of Q&As and the end of us borrowing more time from you, our audience. But I'm so glad that we did, because I feel like I've learned so much from all of our speakers and so thoroughly enjoyed your engagements with these really crucial questions. So let us round off the webinar by just another huge thanks to the speakers. Imagine, if you will, like we have to in football matches now, a massive round of applause in lieu of what would otherwise be a filled room. And my thanks also to Rama. And a reminder to everybody in the audience, please do sign up to the mailing list link that we've put up on the chat. That will allow you to have access to the recording when it is brought live. And it will also allow you to follow all of the exciting events, programs and processes that are going to go on in the DSA's Decolonising working group. But without further ado, let me bring this to a close with a massive thanks and a gratitude. And we hope to see you all very soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Prof. Hi, Prof. Sabelo.
Oh, hi, how are you? Now I'm
It's nice seeing you. It's nice seeing you. Yeah, we should leave now. It's nice seeing you.
Yeah,
we miss you back.
Of the colleagues.
We miss you.
I know I'm around. We can meet on virtually.
Yeah, I know.
Great.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Great. All of you enjoy your night.
Okay,
thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much for being part of this. Really great. We will share. We will follow up with the recording.
You know,
thank you so much.
I learned a lot, and it's necessary that we have more of these.
Yes, and we appreciate really your time. We don't take it for granted. We know really it's the first week of the semester.
Yeah.
So thanks to all for making yourself available.
Thank you.
Thank you.